The locomotive's whistle shrieked across the wasteland like a dying animal, black smoke billowing into the merciless Arizona sky as it shuddered to a halt beside Dust Valley's weathered platform. The handful of townspeople gathered there fell silent as mourners at a funeral, drawn by word that sin itself was arriving on the afternoon train. Evelyn Hart stepped down from the passenger car, her worn blue dress catching on the rusted step. The fabric bore patches that whispered of poverty and desperation, careful needlework that spoke of pride, maintained despite circumstances. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a faded bonnet that had once been fashionable in St. Louis, and in her gloved hands she clutched a carpetbag containing everything she owned in this world. The platform stretched before her like a stage set for judgment. Weathered wooden planks, stained dark by years of desert sun and occasional rain, creaked under her feet as she took her first steps into Dust Valley. The air shimmered with heat that rose from the railroad tracks like the breath of some subterranean furnace, and the smell of coal smoke mixed with the dry, dusty scent of sage and creosote. A rock struck the platform beside her feet with a sharp crack, sending up a puff of alkaline dust. Then another, this one grazing her shoulder and nearly sending her stumbling backward into the train car. Pain shot through her arm, but she steadied herself, refusing to show weakness before these strangers who had already marked her as prey. The crowd surged forward like a pack of wolves scenting blood. Their faces were carved by desert sun and moral certainty into masks of righteous judgment. Weathered skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones, they squinted from years of staring into harsh light mouths set in hard lines that spoke of lives lived without much joy or mercy. "And no place for your kind here," shrieked a woman in the front rank, her voice sharp as broken glass. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and wearing a black dress that made her look like a carrion crow. "We got standards in this town." More voices joined the chorus of condemnation, each accusation building on the last, like stones in a wall of hatred. Jezebel, whore, devil's daughter. The words struck Evelyn like physical blows, each one carrying the weight of assumptions and judgments made by people who knew nothing of her story. Her struggles, her desperate fight for survival, in a world that offered women like her precious few legitimate options. Sheriff Bram Kincaid emerged from the pack like a wolf from his den, and Evelyn felt her blood turn to ice water. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair and eyes the color of winter frost. His face was deeply lined, carved by years of wielding power over this isolated community. And there was something in his bearing that spoke of casual cruelty, held in check only by the thinnest veneer of civilization. The badge pinned to his vest caught the harsh afternoon light like a scale on some predatory reptile. In his weathered hand was a crumpled letter, the very one that had brought Evelyn to this God-forsaken place, with promises of honest work and a fresh start. She recognized the paper, the careful script, even the small tear in one corner, where she had clutched it too tightly during the long train ride from St. Louis. "Miss Evelyn Hart," he said, his voice carrying the kind of false politeness that made decent people's skin crawl. "I believe there's been some kind of mistake." With slow theatrical ceremony, he held up the letter so everyone could see it, then tore it precisely in half. The ripping sound seemed unnaturally loud in the desert air. Then he tore it again and again, letting the pieces flutter from his fingers like dying moths. The wind caught them immediately, scattering them across the platform and out into the sagebrush, carrying away her last hope of legitimacy in this place. A glob of tobacco juice splattered on the wooden planks near her feet, the brown stain spreading like an accusation. The crowd pressed closer, and Evelyn could smell their sweat, their excitement, their hunger for violence, dressed up as moral cleansing. "In this town, I am the law." Kincaid growled, his hand dropping to rest casually on the butt of his gun. "And the law don't bend for whores." It was then, in that moment, when despair threatened to overwhelm her completely, that she noticed the man apart from the mob. Wesley Rowan sat his paint horse at the very edge of the platform, perhaps 20 yards from the main crowd. He was tall and lean, in the way of men who worked hard for their living, with dark hair touched silver at the temples and eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over distant mountains. His face was deeply tanned and marked by lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow, carved by years of frontier life into something as enduring as the red rocks that surrounded this valley. Unlike the others, he wasn't shouting or spitting or pressing forward for a better view of the spectacle. He simply sat his horse with the easy grace of a man, born to the saddle, watching the scene unfold with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read danger in all its many forms. There was something in his stillness that reminded Evelyn of a hawk circling high overhead, patient, observant, ready to act when the moment demanded it. His clothes were simple working man's attire: denim pants worn soft with age, a cotton shirt that had been carefully mended in several places, boots that had walked many miles through difficult country. But there was a quality to his bearing that spoke of inner strength, of a man who had faced hard choices and lived with the consequences. When their eyes met across the platform, she saw something unexpected. Not pity exactly, but recognition. The look of one lost soul acknowledging another. Wes, Sheriff Kincaid, called out, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "You got business here, or are you just enjoying the entertainment?" Wesley dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. His boots hit the wooden planks with a solid thunk, and he began walking toward the crowd with measured steps. The mob parted before him reluctantly, some of the men nodding respectfully, others watching him with the wary attention due to someone who couldn't be easily classified as friend or enemy. "They came for my seed order," Wesley said, his voice carrying the dusty roughness of the frontier. "Didn't expect to find a circus." Kincaid's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "Well, now you have. Maybe you can help us convince this lady that she'd be happier somewhere else." Wesley came to a stop, perhaps 6 feet from Evelyn, close enough that she could see the small scar that ran along his left jawline and the way his gray eyes took in every detail of her appearance, without making her feel like a specimen under glass. When he spoke, his words were addressed to her rather than to the crowd. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that struck the assembled townspeople like a slap. "Wesley Rowan. I got a ranch about 10 miles north of here. You need a place to stay while you figure out your next move, you're welcome to it." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Evelyn stared at this stranger who was willing to defy an entire town for someone he had never met, and she wondered what kind of pain had taught him such dangerous compassion. "I can work," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. "Cook, clean, mend. I won't be charity." "Wouldn't expect you to be." Sheriff Kincaid stepped between them, his face darkening with anger. "Wes, you're making a mistake. This woman is poison. She'll bring nothing but trouble to your place." Wesley's eyes grew cold as winter sky, and for a moment, Evelyn glimpsed the steel beneath his quiet exterior. "Sheriff, with all due respect, I've had enough trouble in my life to know what it looks like. And this ain't it." He picked up her carpet bag. Noting its weight, she realized cataloging the few possessions that represented her entire worldly wealth, and secured it behind his saddle with practiced efficiency. Then he offered her his hand, strong fingers marked by calluses and old scars, palm rough with honest work. She hesitated for just a moment, knowing that accepting his help would mark her as his responsibility in the eyes of the town, would make him a target for their hatred as well as herself. But the alternative was standing alone on this platform until the sun set and the desert cold claimed her, or worse, until the crowd's ugly mood turned to actual violence. She took his hand. His grip was firm and warm, steadying her as she mounted behind him on the paint horse. The animal was well trained and patient, accepting the additional weight without complaint. Wesley's body was solid and reassuring in front of her, and she caught the scent of soap and leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her feel safer than she had in months. As they rode away from the platform, the hostile shouts of the crowd fading behind them, like the noise of some distant storm, Evelyn caught one last glimpse of Sheriff Kincaid's face in the station window. The expression she saw there wasn't just anger or disgust, it was fear. Cold, calculating fear that spoke of secrets buried and sins carefully hidden from the light of day. Her arrival in this godforsaken place had disturbed something much deeper than moral outrage, something that powerful men would kill to keep buried in the desert sand. The ride to Wesley's ranch took them through country that was both beautiful and harsh. Painted in shades of red and gold and burned amber by the late afternoon sun. Towering rock formations rose from the desert floor like the ruins of some ancient civilization carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes that seemed to change as the light shifted across their surfaces. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against the sky, their arms raised in permanent supplication to gods who had abandoned this land to silence and solitude. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, the kind of quiet that comes between people who understand that words can sometimes do more harm than good. Wesley rode with the easy competence of a man who had spent his life in wild country, reading the landscape for signs of weather water and danger. Evelyn found herself studying the back of his neck, noting the way his dark hair curled slightly at the collar, the proud set of his shoulders, the careful way he held himself, that spoke of old injuries not quite healed. They forded a shallow creek that cut through the valley floor, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones. Cottonwood trees grew along its banks, their leaves rustling in the evening breeze like whispered secrets. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the canyon walls, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered, with a long, mournful howl. Beautiful country. Evelyn said finally, more to break the silence than because she expected a response. It can be, Wesley replied, when it's not trying to kill you. The ranch house appeared as they crested a low ridge nestled in a natural hollow that provided protection from the worst of the desert winds. It was a substantial structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide front porch that faced east toward the rising sun. Outbuildings clustered around the main house like chicks around a hen, a barn, a chicken coop, a well-housed corrals for horses and cattle. But even from a distance, Evelyn could see signs of neglect. Paint peeling from the shutters, weeds growing in what had once been a carefully tended garden. An air of abandonment that spoke of dreams deferred and hopes slowly dying. This was a place that had been built with love and optimism. But those emotions had been leached away by time and tragedy, leaving behind only the bones of what might have been. Wesley helped her down from the horse with courteous efficiency, his hands briefly spanning her waist as he lifted her to the ground. For just a moment they stood close together, and she was acutely aware of his height, his strength, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Then he stepped back, suddenly awkward, as if he had revealed more than he intended. House isn't much to look at, he said, not meeting her eyes. Been letting things slide since. He didn't finish the sentence, but Evelyn could fill in the blanks. Since his wife died. Since his world collapsed. Since he stopped believing that the future held anything worth working toward. It's fine, she said simply. Better than fine, thank you. The interior of the house told the same story as the exterior, good bones, careful craftsmanship, but an air of profound loneliness that seemed to permeate every room. The kitchen was spacious and well-designed, with a large wood-burning stove and ample counter space. But the dishes were stacked haphazardly, and dust motes danced in the afternoon light, streaming through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. The parlor held the remnants of a woman's touch-lace curtains, yellow with age, a piano that hadn't been tuned in years, photographs on the mantelpiece showing happier times. Evelyn's eyes lingered on one image in particular, a younger Wesley, his face unmarked by grief, standing behind a pretty blonde woman who held a small child in her arms. They looked radiantly happy, complete untouched by the tragedies that would soon tear their world apart. Sarah and Jacob, Wesley said quietly, following her gaze. My wife and son. Fever took them both 3 years ago. The pain in his voice was still fresh, still sharp enough to cut. Evelyn had heard that particular note of anguish before in her own voice, when she spoke of her brother Thomas in her mother's voice, during those final months when consumption slowly stole her breath away. I'm sorry, she said and meant it. How old was your son? 3. Just old enough to start asking questions about everything, to follow me around the ranch like a shadow. Wesley's voice grew rough with memory. Fever hit the valley that summer, came through like wildfire. I rode 20 miles to fetch the doctor, but by the time we got back, he didn't need to finish. Evelyn could picture the scene all too clearly, a man riding hell for leather across desert country, hope driving him past exhaustion, only to arrive home and find that he was too late, that the most important people in his world had slipped away while he was gone. Sarah always said this house was too big for just the two of us. Wesley continued, his eyes still fixed on the photograph. Said we'd need to fill it with children and laughter and life. After they died, I used to think about selling it, moving somewhere smaller. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. This was their home. These walls heard Jacob's first words, saw Sarah's smile every morning when she came down to make breakfast. How do you sell something like that? You don't, Evelyn said softly. You carry it with you, and you try to honor it by building something new. Wesley looked at her sharply, as if her words had struck some chord he hadn't expected. You sound like you know something about loss, more than I'd like. Evelyn moved away from the photographs, suddenly uncomfortable with the weight of his attention. We all carry our ghosts, Mr. Rowan. The trick is not letting them bury us alive. That first evening passed quietly, almost peacefully. Evelyn cooked dinner from the supplies Wesley had on hand, salt pork and beans cornbread, baked in the big iron skillet coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. It was simple fare, but it was the first home-cooked meal Wesley had eaten in months, and she could see his appreciation in the careful way he savored each bite. They ate mostly in silence, the comfortable quiet of two people who had both learned that conversation could be a luxury they couldn't always afford. But gradually, tentatively, they began to share small pieces of their stories. Wesley spoke of the ranch, of the challenges of running cattle in country that seemed designed to kill anything that tried to live there. Evelyn told him about her journey west, about the succession of jobs and boarding houses and temporary arrangements that had brought her to this place. She was careful with the truth, parsing it carefully to avoid outright lies, while omitting the details that would reveal her real purpose in Dust Valley. She had been a seamstress in St. Louis, she said, working for a dressmaker who catered to wealthy ladies. When the business failed, she had answered an advertisement for domestic help in Arizona Territory, only to discover upon arrival that the position had been filled by someone else. It was close enough to the truth to feel honest, far enough from it to keep her secret safe. Wesley listened without judgment, asking no prying questions, accepting her story at face value, with the kind of courtesy that had become rare in her experience. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, he said as they cleared the dishes. There's a spare room upstairs, hasn't been used in a while, but it's clean and dry. And there's plenty of work around here if you're serious about earning your keep. I'm serious, Evelyn replied. More serious than you might think. That night alone in the spare bedroom that still smelled faintly of lavender sachets placed there by a woman long dead, Evelyn sat by the window and stared out at the star-filled desert sky. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant cry of coyotes and the soft sighing of wind through the eaves. She had grown accustomed to the noise of cities, to the constant background hum of human activity that marked civilization's presence. This deep quiet was something new, almost unsettling in its completeness. She thought about her mission, about the federal authorities who had sent her to this remote corner of Arizona territory to investigate rumors of corruption and criminal activity. Sheriff Kincaid was the primary target, suspected of running protection rackets and skimming money from territorial funds. But after seeing him in action on the train platform, Evelyn was beginning to suspect that his crimes went far deeper than simple graft. There had been something in his eyes when he looked at her, something that spoke of secrets carefully guarded and violence casually employed. This was not simply a corrupt lawman supplementing his income with bribes and kickbacks. This was a predator who had found a perfect hunting ground in an isolated frontier community where his word was law and his authority went largely unchallenged. But investigating him would require care, patience, and a cover story that would hold up under scrutiny. Her original plan had been to pose as a saloon girl or dance hall worker, positions that would give her access to the kind of men who might know Kincaid's secrets. That plan had been derailed by the town's hostile reception, but perhaps this new arrangement might serve her purposes even better. As Wesley's housekeeper and companion, she would be positioned to observe the comings and goings of the local ranchers and businessmen who did business with him. She could cultivate relationships with their wives, perhaps gain access to social gatherings where liquor might loosen tongues and old grievances might be aired. It would require her to maintain her deception for an extended period, to live a lie, while growing closer to a man who was already showing her more kindness than she had received in years. The thought troubled her more than she cared to admit. Wesley Rowan was a good man, damaged by loss, but fundamentally decent in a way that was becoming increasingly rare in her experience. He deserved honesty, not manipulation. He deserved someone who could love him without reservation, not a federal agent who was using his loneliness and generosity to further her own professional objectives. But she had a job to do, and lives potentially hung in the balance. If Kincaid was as dangerous as she suspected, then other innocent people would suffer if he was allowed to continue operating with impunity. She would have to find a way to balance her growing feelings for Wesley with her duty to the law, to extract the information she needed without destroying the fragile trust that was building between them. Outside her window, a shooting star blazed across the sky and disappeared behind the mountains, leaving behind only darkness and the ancient silence of the desert. Evelyn made a wish on that falling star, though she wasn't sure exactly what she was wishing for. Love, perhaps, or redemption, or simply the strength to do what needed to be done, without losing what remained of her soul in the process. The next morning brought more than just desert sunrise painted in shades of gold and crimson across the eastern sky. When Wesley went out to tend to his morning chores, he found evidence that their troubles were far from over. Someone had been busy during the night, and their message was unmistakable. The barn windows, 3 large panes of glass that had cost him a small fortune to transport from Tucson, lay shattered on the ground, glittering like malicious diamonds in the early light. Painted across the barn door in letters 3 feet high, using what appeared to be a mixture of red paint and something darker that Wesley preferred not to identify, was a single word, whore. But it was the paper nailed to his front gate that made his blood run cold. The petition was written in Martha Fitch's precise schoolteacher's hand, the language dressed up in the kind of righteous rhetoric that made evil sound like justice. We, the undersigned citizens of Dust Valley, hereby demand the immediate removal of one Evelyn Hart, known associate of houses of ill repute, whose presence in our community poses a direct threat to the moral welfare of our children and the sanctity of our Christian values. This woman's reputation precedes her, and her continued presence among decent, God-fearing people is an affront to all that we hold sacred. We call upon Wesley Rowan to cease harboring this creature of sin, and upon our duly elected sheriff to take whatever action may be necessary to preserve the purity of our community. 47 signatures followed, representing nearly half the adult population of Dust Valley and its surrounding ranches. Wesley recognized most of the named storekeepers and farmers' ranchers and their wives, even the minister of the local Methodist church. People he had known for years who had shared his grief when Sarah and Jacob died, who had offered their condolences and their casseroles and their awkward attempts at comfort. Now they were ready to see him destroyed simply for offering shelter to a woman in need. Evelyn appeared at his elbow, having approached so quietly that he hadn't heard her footsteps. She was already dressed for the day, in a simple brown dress that emphasized her slender figure. Her dark hair pinned up in a practical style that made her look younger, somehow more vulnerable than the composed woman who had stepped off the train yesterday. 47 signatures, she said quietly, reading over his shoulder. In a town of maybe 200 souls. They're afraid. Wesley replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. Afraid that if someone like you can find a place here, then maybe their own secrets aren't as well hidden as they think. Before Evelyn could ask what he meant by that cryptic comment, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached their ears. Through the morning haze, they could see a dust cloud moving up the valley road too large to be a single rider or even a small group. This was a delegation, and delegations in frontier country usually meant trouble. Sheriff Kincaid rode at the head of the column, his badge glinting in the morning sun like a warning. Behind him came a dozen men on horseback, his official deputies, plus several prominent citizens of Dust Valley. Wesley recognized the mayor, the president of the local bank, the man who owned the largest general store. These were the pillars of the community, the men whose opinions carried weight and whose displeasure could destroy a man's livelihood with a few well-placed words. They reined up just outside the gate, their horses stamping and snorting in the cool morning air. The riders arranged themselves in a rough semicircle, a formation that looked casual but was actually designed to prevent escape and demonstrate overwhelming force. These men had come prepared for resistance. Morning, Wes. Kincaid said, his tone deceptively casual. Heard you might be having some trouble out here. Wesley stepped off his porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands, but positioned where it could be brought to bear quickly if necessary. Nothing I can't handle, Sheriff. See, that's where you're wrong. Kincaid dismounted with the deliberate slowness of a man who was supremely confident in his position. This situation has gotten way beyond what any one man can handle. You got half the town signing petitions, good Christian folk afraid to let their children walk to school. All because you're harboring a known prostitute. Watch your mouth. Wesley warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Kincaid's smile was cold as winter moonlight. Truth hurt, does it? Tell you what, Wes. I'm willing to be reasonable about this. Send the woman packing and we'll call it even. Hell, I'll even help you clean up this mess. He gestured toward the broken windows and painted slur with theatrical magnanimity. And if I don't, and then I'd have to start wondering about your fitness to hold this land. Bank note coming due soon, ain't it? The sheriff's voice took on a conversational tone that made his words even more threatening. Be a shame if questions got raised about your ability to make good on it. A lot of accidents can happen to a man's livestock, his water rights, his reputation. Drought years are hard on everybody, but they're especially hard on folks who don't have the support of their community. The threat was clear and devastating. In a territory where a man's reputation was his most valuable asset, even unfounded accusations could destroy him. Banks would call in loans, suppliers would demand cash payment, neighbors would shun him as a suspected criminal or moral degenerate. Wesley would lose not just his ranch, but any hope of making a living anywhere in the territory. Mayor Hutchins, a thin, nervous man who had always struck Wesley as decent, if weak, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Now, Sheriff, I don't think we need to talk about accidents or loan irregularities. Wesley's always been good for his debts, and his character has never been in question before he started keeping company with whores. Martha Fitch interjected, her voice sharp with venom. The severe woman had ridden out with the men, despite the impropriety driven by a hatred that burned hotter than the desert sun. before he chose sin over righteousness, vice over virtue. Wesley's hands tightened on his rifle. "Mrs. Fitch, you've got exactly 5 seconds to get off my land before I forget you're a woman. You'd threaten a God-fearing widow." Martha's eyes blazed with righteous indignation. "You'd raise your hand against a woman whose only crime is trying to protect the moral fabric of our community. I'd protect my guest from a pack of sanctimonious hypocrites who wouldn't know Christian charity if it bit them on the ass." The crude language caused several of the men to stiffen in their saddles, but it was Kincaid who responded, his voice taking on a harder edge. "That's enough, Wes. You're outnumbered here and you're in the wrong. Don't make this harder than it has to be." "You son of a bitch," Wesley said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. Kincaid's hand dropped to his gun, and for a moment, violence hung in the air, like heat shimmer over sun-baked rocks. Then, unexpectedly, the sheriff smiled and relaxed his stance. "Like I said, I'm a reasonable man. I'll give you until tomorrow morning to make the right decision. After that..." He shrugged as if the consequences were entirely out of his hands, a natural disaster that could only be survived, not prevented. As the delegation prepared to leave, Kincaid's eyes found Evelyn where she stood in the doorway, and his smile grew colder. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim in a mockery of courtesy, "I do hope you'll consider what's best for everyone involved. Sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is just move on." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. This man was capable of violence, of cruelty, of things that decent people couldn't even imagine. And she was standing directly in his path. After the riders disappeared back down the valley road, Wesley and Evelyn stood together in the sudden silence, processing what had just occurred. The morning had started with such promise. Clear skies, cool air, the kind of fresh beginning that made all things seem possible. Now it felt poisoned, contaminated by hatred and fear, and the ugly reality of human nature at its worst. "I should leave," Evelyn said finally, her voice barely audible. "Before this gets worse. Before they destroy you along with me." Wesley turned to look at her, and she saw something fierce burning in his storm-gray eyes. Like hell. The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. He had been careful since Sarah's death, cautious about emotional commitments, wary of caring too much about anything that could be taken away. But standing here in the ruins of his peaceful morning, watching this woman prepare to sacrifice herself, to protect him from consequences he was perfectly capable of facing, he felt something long dormant stirring in his chest. "I mean it, Evelyn. I won't be run off my own land by a pack of sanctimonious hypocrites with more hate than sense. And I won't let them run you off either. Wesley, you could lose everything: your ranch, your livelihood, your place in this community. I'm not worth that kind of sacrifice." "Don't you tell me what you're worth," he said sharply. "Don't you dare stand there and let their poison convince you that you deserve less than basic human decency." Before Evelyn could respond, the sound of a single horse approaching at speed interrupted their conversation. But this rider was coming from the north rather than from town, and Wesley relaxed slightly when he recognized the figure on horseback. The newcomer was a woman, though it took a moment to realize it. She wore men's clothing, denim pants, a cotton shirt, boots designed for hard use rather than fashion. Her dark hair was braided and pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, and there was a rifle scabbard attached to her saddle. She rode with the easy competence of someone who had spent most of her life on horseback, sitting straight in the saddle with the kind of unconscious grace that came from years of practice. "Wesley," she called out as she reined up near the gate. "Heard there was trouble brewing down this way. Rosa." Wesley's greeting was warm, tinged with obvious relief. "Didn't expect to see you so soon." Rosa Valdez dismounted and tied her horse to the gatepost, her movements economical and purposeful. Up close, Evelyn could see that she was probably 40, with the kind of weathered beauty that came from a life spent outdoors. Her dark eyes missed nothing as they took in the broken windows, the painted slur, the tension that still hung in the air, like smoke. Trouble has a way of traveling fast in empty country, Rosa said. Especially when it involves Sheriff Kincaid and his particular brand of justice. She offered her hand to Evelyn, with straightforward courtesy. Rosa Valdez. I run a small spread about 5 miles north of here. You must be the woman who's got half of Dust Valley in an uproar. Evelyn Hart. And I'm sorry if my presence here has caused problems for you as well. Rosa's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Honey, my problems with Kincaid started long before you arrived on that train. If anything, you might be just what this valley needs. Wesley frowned. What do you mean? I mean that sometimes it takes an outsider to make people see what's been right in front of their faces all along. Rosa's expression grew serious. Kincaid's been running more than protection rackets, Wesley. There's things going on in these mountains that would make decent people sick to their stomachs if they knew. But as long as everyone keeps their heads down and their mouths shut, the sheriff's happy to let them pretend they live in a civilized community. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of information she had been sent to uncover, but she had to be careful not to show too much interest too quickly. What kind of things? Rosa studied her for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Silver mining, for one thing. There's a played-out claim up in Devil's Canyon that's supposed to be abandoned. Except it's not abandoned. It's being worked by Chinese laborers, who were brought in under false pretenses and are now being held against their will. Slave labor, in other words, with the profits going straight into Kincaid's pocket. Wesley stared at her in shock. Are you certain? Certain enough to have ridden up there myself and seen the operation with my own eyes. Guards, barbed wire men working in conditions that would kill most people within a year. And that's just what I could see from a distance. The implications were staggering. If Rosa was right, then Kincaid wasn't just a corrupt sheriff supplementing his income with graft. He was running a criminal enterprise that involved kidnapping, slavery, and murder. The territorial authorities would be very interested in such information, assuming it could be properly documented and verified. Why haven't you reported this to the territorial marshal? Evelyn asked. Rosa's smile was bitter. Because the territorial marshal is Judge Holloway's brother-in-law, and Judge Holloway has been in Kincaid's pocket for years. The whole system is corrupt from top to bottom. That's why I've been waiting for the right opportunity, the right catalyst to bring it all crashing down. She looked directly at Evelyn as she spoke, and there was something in her dark eyes that suggested she knew more about her new acquaintance than she was letting on. Sometimes justice requires patience, but sometimes it requires someone willing to light the fuse. Before anyone could respond to this cryptic statement, Rosa continued with more practical concerns. In the meantime, you two need to be prepared for what's coming. Kincaid didn't ride out here with half the town council just to make threats. He's testing your resolve, seeing how far he can push before you break. And when he decides you're not going to fold quietly, he'll escalate. Escalate how? Wesley asked. Accidents, mysterious fires, cattle stampedes in the middle of the night. Maybe some of his boys will get liquored up and decide to pay a social call. Rosa's expression was grim. Miguel and I went through this same dance 2 years ago. We thought we could tough it out, thought our neighbors would come to their senses and see Kincaid for what he really was. Her voice grew quiet, heavy with old pain. Miguel died defending our home when Kincaid's men came calling one night. They burned our barn, poisoned our well, and when my husband tried to fight back, they shot him down like a dog. Then they claimed he was rustling cattle, that he had resisted lawful arrest. The silence that followed her words was profound, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Wesley and Evelyn exchanged glances, both understanding that they were hearing the true cost of opposing Sheriff Kincaid's authority. "I'm sorry," Wesley said simply. "Miguel was a good man." "Yes, he was. And his death won't be in vain if we can finally bring Kincaid to justice." Rosa's eyes hardened. "But it's going to take more than hope and good intentions. We need evidence, documentation, witnesses willing to testify. And we need to be prepared for a fight." That evening, as the three of them sat around Wesley's kitchen table planning their next moves, none of them could have anticipated how quickly events would spiral beyond their control. The storm that had been building over Dust Valley was about to break with devastating force. The attack came just after midnight, announced by the thunder of many horses moving fast through the darkness. Wesley woke to the sound of breaking glass and Rosa's sharp warning cry from the parlor where she had chosen to sleep, unwilling to leave them undefended. "They're here," she shouted. "At least 20 riders." Wesley rolled out of bed and grabbed his rifle. His mind instantly clear, despite the abrupt awakening. 3 years of solitary living had honed his instincts to a razor's edge, and he could tell from the sound of the horses that this wasn't a casual visit. This was a coordinated assault planned and executed with military precision. Evelyn appeared in the hallway already dressed and carrying the small pistol she had kept hidden in her carpet bag. Her federal training was evident in the calm professional way she moved, checking the weapon's load and positioning herself to cover the stairway. "How many?" she asked quietly. "Too many," Rosa replied from below. "And they've surrounded the house." The first shots came through the kitchen windows, shattering glass and sending splinters flying like shrapnel. But these weren't the wild, undisciplined shots of a drunken mob. They were carefully aimed rounds, designed to pin down the defenders, while other attackers moved into position. Wesley made his way to the front window and peered through a gap in the shutters. What he saw made his blood run cold. Kincaid's forces had indeed surrounded the ranch house, but they weren't the same collection of frightened townsmen who had ridden out that morning. These were professional killer's men with the hard eyes and casual manner of those who made their living with violence. At their head rode Sheriff Kincaid himself, but he was no longer bothering with the pretense of lawful authority. His badge was nowhere to be seen, and the men around him carried themselves like soldiers rather than deputies. This was an execution squad, pure and simple. Wes Rowan. Kincaid's voice boomed across the yard. "You've had your chance to do this the easy way. Now we do it mine." The second wave of gunfire was more intense, coming from multiple directions, as the attackers attempted to overwhelm the defenders through sheer volume of lead. Windows exploded, inward bullets thudded into walls and furniture, and the acrid smell of gunpowder began to fill the house. Wesley, Evelyn, and Rosa fought back with disciplined fire, making every shot count. But they were vastly outnumbered, and their ammunition was limited. Worse, the attackers had all night to wear them down, while the defenders were trapped in a building that could easily become their tomb. "We can't hold them," Rosa said during a brief lull, blood seeping from a graze across her forehead where a bullet had come too close. "They're just playing with us." Wesley peered through the shutters again, studying the attackers' positions. Most were townsmen. He recognized the blacksmith, several shop owners, even young men barely old enough to shave. Fear and mob mentality had transformed them into something unrecognizable, their familiar faces twisted with hatred and bloodlust. But among Kincaid's forces was a stranger, who caught Wesley's attention, a lean, cold-eyed man in expensive clothes, who moved with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to violence, while the others shot wildly or took cover at the first sign of return fire. This man studied the house with tactical precision, calculating angles and weak points like a military engineer. "Who's the professional?" Wesley asked Rosa. She followed his gaze, and her face went pale. "Cole Brennan. Heard he was a Union sharpshooter during the war, turned gun for hire after. If Kincaid brought him in, we're in serious trouble." As if hearing his name, Brennan raised his rifle and sent a bullet through the exact spot where Wesley's head had been moments before. The shot was so precise, it left splinters in his hair, a clear demonstration that the gunman could have killed him easily if that had been his intention. He's not trying to kill us yet, Wesley realized with growing dread. He's just showing us he can whenever he wants to. The realization was terrifying. This wasn't a desperate last stand between equals. It was a cat playing with mice, drawing out their agony for the amusement of the predators. That's when the eastern wall of the house erupted in flames. While the defenders had been focused on the obvious threat from the front and sides, other attackers had crept close enough to douse the wooden walls with coal oil and set them ablaze. The fire spread with terrifying speed, fed by the dry timber and desert wind, filling the house with choking smoke. The root cellar, Evelyn shouted, pointing toward a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. We can make a stand there. But as they fought their way toward the cellar through smoke and gunfire, disaster struck. Cole Brennan had been waiting for exactly this moment, when the defenders were pinned down and desperate. His rifle spoke once a sound like thunder, and Rosa Valdez cried out as blood bloomed across her shoulder. The impact spun her around and sent her crashing into the overturned kitchen table. She tried to rise, but her left arm hung useless at her side, and blood was spreading rapidly across her shirt. Rosa. Wesley started toward her, but she waved him off with her good hand. I'm all right, keep moving. But she wasn't all right. The bullet had shattered her shoulder blade and torn through muscle and sinew, leaving her unable to use her rifle effectively. She was losing blood fast, and in her condition, she couldn't keep fighting much longer. They made it to the root cellar just as the floor above them began to sag from the heat of the flames. The thick wooden planks and stone walls provided temporary sanctuary, but the smoke was getting thicker and they could hear the sound of burning timber beginning to collapse. We've got maybe 10 minutes before this whole place comes down on our heads, Wesley said, checking Rosa's wound as best he could in the dim light. The bullet had gone clean through, which was good, but she was losing blood faster than he could stop it. Then we'd better make them count, Evelyn replied, reloading her pistol with the last of her ammunition. It was then, trapped in that smoky hole with death closing in from all sides, that she made her choice. The mission, her cover, her carefully constructed identity, none of it mattered now. These people who had become her family were about to die, and she couldn't save them with lies. Wesley, she said quietly. There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you from the beginning. He looked at her through the smoke and flickering light, and something in her voice made his blood run cold. What? My name is Evelyn Hart, but I'm not what you think I am. I'm not a seamstress or a domestic worker running from a failed business. She took a shaky breath, tasting smoke and defeat. I'm a federal agent. I was sent here to investigate Kincaid's operation to gather evidence of his crimes. The words hit Wesley like a physical blow. For a moment he couldn't speak, couldn't even process what she had just told him. Everything he thought he knew about her, everything he had felt, had been built on a foundation of lies. You're a federal agent, he repeated numbly. I was. I quit the moment I realized what this place meant to me. What you meant to me. Tears were streaming down her face, now cutting tracks through the smoke and grime. I know you'll never forgive me for lying, but I needed you to know the truth before we die down here. He finished, his voice flat with shock and betrayal. Before we die down here. Rosa, despite her wounds and the blood loss that was making her increasingly weak, managed a bitter laugh. Well, that explains a lot. Here I thought you were just naturally good with that pistol. But Wesley wasn't laughing. He was staring at Evelyn, as if seeing her for the first time, trying to reconcile the woman he had fallen in love with, because yes, he could admit it. Now he had fallen in love with her, with this revelation that everything between them had been based on deception. How much of it was real? He asked, his voice hoarse with emotion and smoke. Any of it, All of it. Her voice broke on the words. Every moment, every feeling, every conversation we shared. I may have started this as an agent following orders, but I fell in love as a woman discovering what it meant to be truly seen and accepted by another person. The cover story was a lie, but what I felt for you was the most honest thing in my life. Before Wesley could respond, a new sound reached them through the smoke and flames, the thunder of many horses approaching fast. But these weren't reinforcements for Kincaid. The sound was different, more organized, accompanied by shouts in Spanish and the distinctive crack of military-style rifles being fired in disciplined volleys. What the hell? Wesley peered up through the cellar opening, trying to see through the smoke and flames that were consuming his home. Rosa smiled through her pain, her face pale, but her eyes bright with something that might have been satisfaction. Remember when I said I'd been watching this valley for days? Well, I wasn't just watching. I was sending messages. The rescue came from the most unexpected source imaginable. The very people Sheriff Kincaid had been oppressing and exploiting for years. Led by Rosa's brother Carlos, a weathered man in his 50s, who had once been a sergeant in the Mexican army, a force of 20 mounted men swept down on the burning ranch like avenging angels. They weren't professional soldiers, these rescuers. They were farmers and ranchers, shop owners and laborers, men who had been quietly enduring Kincaid's corruption and brutality while waiting for someone brave enough to make a stand. But they were armed, organized, and motivated by years of accumulated grievances. More importantly, they had brought with them several Chinese workers who had managed to escape from Kincaid's illegal mining operation. These men carried with them not just first-hand testimony of the conditions in the mountain camps, but also stolen documents that detailed the full scope of the sheriff's criminal enterprise. The tide of battle turned in minutes. Caught between the burning house and a force of angry citizens who knew exactly what crimes they were fighting to expose, most of Kincaid's hired guns either surrendered or fled into the desert. The few who tried to make a stand were quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers and righteous fury. Sheriff Kincaid himself was captured trying to escape on horseback, his fine boots caked with mud, and his authority reduced to empty threats and bargaining pleas. But it was Cole Brennan who provided the final devastating twist to the night's events. As the smoke cleared and the survivors emerged from their hiding places, the hired gunman stepped forward with his hands raised. But instead of surrendering, he spoke words that changed everything anyone thought they knew about the situation. Agent Brennan, Department of Justice. I've been undercover in Kincaid's organization for 6 months, gathering evidence of his criminal activities. Wesley stared at the man who had nearly killed them all, his mind struggling to process this latest revelation. You're a federal agent. That's correct. And I apologize for the shoulder wound, Mrs. Valdez. I had to maintain my cover until the last possible moment, but I made sure the bullet went clean through muscle rather than bone. You'll heal with proper medical attention. Rosa looked down at her bandaged shoulder, then back at Brennan with a mixture of anger and grudging respect. You son of a bitch. You couldn't have just wounded me in the leg. The shoulder was more convincing from a tactical standpoint. Besides, based on your reputation, I figured you were tough enough to handle it. Evelyn stepped forward, her face pale with shock and growing anger. I wasn't told about any other agents. This was supposed to be my operation, my investigation. Brennan's smile was cold as winter moonlight. That's because your operation was compromised from the beginning, Agent Hart. Someone in the department leaked your identity and mission parameters to Kincaid 3 weeks ago. We've been using you as a stalking horse while I gathered the real evidence. The betrayal hit Evelyn like a second physical blow, this one perhaps more devastating than the first. Not only had her superiors lied to her about the scope and nature of the operation, they had deliberately put her in mortal danger to protect their real asset. She had been expendable from the moment she stepped off that train, a sacrificial pawn in a larger game, whose rules she had never been told. The mine, she said numbly, her training helping her focus on the tactical situation, even as her personal world crumbled around her. The Chinese workers. The evidence of corruption reaching into the territorial government. You knew about all of it. Every detail. Illegal silver mining operation using enslaved labor money, laundering through fraudulent cattle sales protection rackets, backed by federal judges on Kincaid's payroll. We have documented evidence of crimes involving dozens of officials throughout Arizona territory. Brennan's voice was professionally detached, as if he were discussing crop reports rather than lives destroyed by systematic corruption. We've gathered enough material to bring down half the territorial government and reshape the political landscape of the entire region. Wesley looked between the two federal agents, one who had lied to him out of what she claimed was love, the other who had nearly murdered them all in service of his mission, and felt something fundamental break inside his chest. Everything he had believed about honor, about truth, about the possibility of human connection had been revealed as naive fantasy. So what happens now? He asked, his voice carrying a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. Now Sheriff Kincaid goes to federal prison for the rest of his natural life, along with his major associates and the territorial officials who enabled his crimes. The mining operation gets shut down, the workers get freed and compensated, and Dust Valley gets a new sheriff who actually serves the law rather than subverting it. Brennan holstered his weapon with practiced efficiency. As for you folks, I'd suggest staying close to home for the next few weeks while we sort out the political ramifications. There are going to be a lot of angry people looking for someone to blame when this story breaks in the territorial newspapers. But it was Evelyn who asked the question that mattered most to her. What about us, Wesley and me? Brennan looked at her with something that might have been sympathy, though it was hard to tell with his professional mask firmly in place. That's between you and him, Agent Hart. The department has no interest in your personal life, assuming you still want to work for us after this debacle. I don't. The words came out flat and final, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. I'm done with lies and cover stories and using innocent people as bait in games they don't even know they're playing. Consider this my resignation effective immediately. Your choice. But you'll still need to return to Washington for debriefing, and you'll be required to testify at the trials. This case is going to generate a lot of attention at very high levels of government. As Brennan walked away to oversee the arrest of the remaining suspects, Wesley and Evelyn found themselves alone for the first time since the battle began. The ranch house was a smoking ruin. Rosa was being tended by one of the Chinese workers who had medical training, and the future stretched before them like an unmarked trail through dangerous country. Around them, the aftermath of violence was slowly being sorted out. Bodies were being identified and prepared for burial. Prisoners were being secured for transport to territorial custody, and the complex process of documenting evidence was beginning. But for Wesley and Evelyn, the most important conversation was yet to come. So, Wesley said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Evelyn Hart, federal agent. Former federal agent. And everything else I told you about my background was true. My childhood in Philadelphia, my father, the police captain, my mother's death from consumption. The work with the Pinkerton agency was real too, though I may have understated exactly what kind of cases I handled. She looked at the ruins of what had been their home, smoke still rising from the collapsed roof beams. This was supposed to be my last assignment. After this, I was going to retire, find a quiet place to settle down, and try to build a normal life. And now, Evelyn turned to face him, and he saw in her eyes all the vulnerability she had hidden behind her various professional masks. The federal agent, the undercover operative, the woman fleeing a scandalous past, all of them had been real in their own way. But none of them had been complete. Now, for the first time, he was seeing the whole person, damaged and complex and utterly human. Now I'm exactly what I was when I stepped off that train 3 days ago, a woman with nowhere to go and no one to trust. Except, She hesitated, afraid to voice the hope that was growing in her chest like a fragile flame. Except maybe a stubborn rancher who's fool enough to love a liar and a spy. Wesley was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert landscape painted gold and crimson by the rising sun. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but sad, carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom and recent heartbreak. I do love you, Evelyn. Every version of you. I've met the desperate woman on the train platform, the skilled housekeeper who brought life back to my kitchen, the federal agent who risked everything to tell me the truth when she thought we were about to die. But I don't know if I can trust you. And without trust, love isn't enough to build a life on. I know. She nodded, tears threatening again, despite her efforts to maintain her composure. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I lied to you about everything that mattered, put you in danger, nearly got you killed because of my mission. You'd be smart to walk away and never look back. Well, maybe. But I've never been accused of being particularly smart when it comes to matters of the heart. He took her hands in his, noting how they trembled slightly despite her efforts to project strength and control. Her skin was soft, but marked by small scars, evidence of a life lived more dangerously than her cover story had suggested. These were the hands of someone who had fought for survival, who had made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. Here's what I know for certain. He continued, his voice growing stronger as he worked through his own emotions. The woman who mended my clothes with such careful stitches, who cooked meals that tasted like hope, who made me remember what it felt like to want something beyond mere survival, that woman was real. The woman who tried to leave in the middle of a sandstorm rather than bring trouble to my door was real too. And the woman who just threw away her career and her future to tell me the truth when she thought we were about to die together, she's the most real thing I've encountered in 3 years of living with ghosts. Wesley, I'm not saying I forgive you completely. I'm not saying the trust between us isn't damaged, maybe permanently. But I'm saying I want to try to rebuild it if you're willing to do the hard work that requires. If you're willing to start over to build something honest between us from the ground up, then maybe we can find our way through this together. Evelyn stared at him through tears, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. After everything she had done, all the lies she had told, all the dangers she had brought to his door, he was still willing to take a chance on her. It was more than she deserved, more than she had dared to hope for. You'd really give me another chance, she whispered. After everything, we'd give each other another chance, because I've got my own confession to make. Wesley's voice grew rough with emotion, and she could see the pain and self-doubt he had been carrying since his family's death. When I found you collapsed in that sandstorm, when I thought you might die before I could get you home, I realized something that scared me more than Kincaid's threats or federal conspiracies or anything else that's happened. I realized I'd rather risk everything for something real than lose everything for something safe. You taught me that love isn't about avoiding pain. It's about deciding that some things are worth the risk of being hurt. As they stood together in the ruins of the old life, watching the sun climb higher into the desert sky, and feeling the promise of heat that would soon make the day unbearable. Both understood that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be trials to face in federal courtrooms, testimony to give about crimes and conspiracies, questions to answer about their own roles in the events that had shaken the territory. More importantly, there would be the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust between two people who had both learned to guard their hearts against further damage. But they would face it together as partners rather than strangers, as equals rather than rescuer and rescued. And maybe if they were very lucky and very careful, they might find something worth the effort. 6 weeks later, the trials began in the territorial courthouse in Tucson, a massive adobe structure that had been chosen for its capacity to handle the most complex federal criminal cases in the Southwest. The scope of corruption uncovered by the investigation had shocked even veteran prosecutors. Sheriff Kincaid's network had tentacles reaching into every level of territorial government, from local justices of the peace to federal land commissioners. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters from newspapers across the country, federal officials sent to observe the proceedings, and citizens who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness justice being served. The case had become a symbol of the federal government's commitment to cleaning up the frontier territories and preparing them for eventual statehood. Wesley sat in the witness gallery each day of the proceedings, his left arm finally free of the sling, but still aching in damp weather. The new ranch house was nearing completion, built with lumber purchased using insurance money from the fire, and with volunteer labor provided by many of the same people who had once signed the petition demanding Evelyn's removal. Shame, it seemed, was a powerful motivator for making amends. Rosa Valdez had recovered fully from her shoulder wound and had become something of a celebrity in her own right, lauded in newspaper editorials as an example of frontier courage and determination. She had used her newfound fame to advocate for better treatment of Chinese immigrants and Mexican laborers throughout the territory, and there was talk of her running for territorial delegate when Arizona applied for statehood. But it was Evelyn's testimony that dominated the headlines and filled the gallery to capacity. She took the witness stand on the morning of the fourth day, wearing a simple navy blue dress that managed to suggest both professionalism and respectability. When she placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, her voice was clear and steady, carrying easily to every corner of the packed courtroom. The federal prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Hamilton, who had been sent from Washington specifically to handle this case, began with routine questions designed to establish her credentials and the scope of her investigation. Evelyn answered with professional precision, detailing her background with the Pinkerton Agency, her recruitment by the Department of Justice, and her assignment to investigate rumors of corruption in Dust Valley. Agent Hart, Hamilton continued, can you describe for the court the nature and scope of the criminal enterprise operated by the defendant Kincaid and his associates? It was systematic corruption on a territorial scale. Evelyn replied, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. Sheriff Kincaid and his network had established what amounted to a shadow government using fear, violence, and selective enforcement of the law to control every aspect of life in their jurisdiction. Legitimate businesses were forced to pay protection money. Political opponents were framed on false charges or simply disappeared. And at the center of it all was an illegal mining operation that used enslaved Chinese laborers to extract silver from played-out claims in the mountain regions. And how did you gather evidence of these crimes? By assuming the identity of a woman with a questionable past, someone who would be vulnerable to the kind of moral coercion that Kincaid's network specialized in. My cover as a former saloon worker made me an ideal target for their particular brand of intimidation, while also providing opportunities to observe their operations and gather intelligence. Hamilton walked her through the details of her investigation: the threatening visits, the escalating violence, the final assault on Wesley's ranch that had nearly cost them all their lives. With each revelation, the scope of Kincaid's crimes became clearer, painting a picture of systematic brutality that shocked even hardened court observers. But it was during cross-examination that the defense attorney, a reptilian man named Bradshaw, who had been imported from San Francisco specifically to represent Kincaid, attempted to destroy her credibility by attacking her character and her methods. Miss Hart, or should I say Agent Hart, you testified that you developed personal feelings for Mr. Rowan during the course of your investigation. Did these feelings compromise your professional objectivity? They made me realize that some things are more important than professional advancement or departmental approval. Evelyn replied without hesitation. Yes, I fell in love. But that doesn't invalidate the evidence I gathered or the crimes I witnessed. If anything, it made me more determined to see justice done. Speaking of crimes you witnessed, Bradshaw continued, his voice taking on the predatory tone of a lawyer who smelled blood in the water. Let's discuss your previous assignment for the Pinkerton Agency in Chicago. Are you familiar with a case involving the death of a businessman named Marcus Holloway? The question hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Wesley, who had been prepared for questions about Evelyn's deception regarding her identity, felt his stomach drop as he realized there were still secrets between them that hadn't been revealed. I am familiar with that case, Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite the obvious trap being laid for her. Mr. Holloway died under suspicious circumstances while you were investigating his wife for suspected adultery, did he not? He died of a brain aneurysm. The medical examiner determined that he would have died within days, regardless of any external factors or emotional trauma. But you were present in his home that night, weren't you? In fact, you were in his bedroom when he returned unexpectedly and discovered you in bed with his wife. The murmur that went through the courtroom was audible, but Evelyn held her ground. This moment had been inevitable, she realized. The past had a way of following you, no matter how far you ran or how deeply you tried to bury it. I was conducting an investigation that revealed Mr. Holloway was involved in human trafficking on a massive scale. Young women, some barely more than children, were being forced into prostitution and slave labor. The night he died, he had come home intending to murder his wife because she had discovered evidence of his crimes and was planning to turn him in to federal authorities. Bradshaw pressed harder, trying to paint her as a seductress who had contributed to an innocent man's death through her immoral conduct. But Evelyn was prepared for this attack, and she systematically destroyed his narrative by revealing details of Holloway's criminal network that had been classified as state secrets until recently. Mr. Holloway was not an innocent victim, she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. He was a monster who destroyed dozens of lives for profit. The documents found in his possession after his death led to the liberation of over 100 women and girls from conditions of sexual slavery. If my presence in his home that night prevented him from committing murder and helped expose his crimes, then I consider it one of the few things in my professional career that I'm genuinely proud of. And yet you covered up the circumstances of his death. Bradshaw continued relentlessly. You staged the scene to protect yourself and your lover from the consequences of your actions. I made an error in judgment. Evelyn admitted her honesty, more powerful than any denial could have been. I was young, frightened, and dealing with a situation that my training hadn't adequately prepared me for. But the evidence clearly shows that Marcus Holloway was a criminal who died of natural causes after discovering that his crimes were about to be exposed. If that's divine justice, then I'm grateful to have been its instrument. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand after 2 days of testimony, Wesley was waiting for her in the courthouse hallway. Without a word, he took her in his arms and held her close, feeling the tremor in her body that spoke of emotional exhaustion and the relief of finally having all her secrets exposed to the light. I'm proud of you, he whispered into her hair, for telling the truth even when it was painful, for standing up to them and refusing to be ashamed of doing the right thing. Are you sure? She asked, her voice muffled against his chest. Because I have a feeling the testimony is going to follow me for the rest of my life. People will always whisper about the federal agent who seduced a criminal's wife and covered up his death. Then they can whisper all they want. I know who you really are, and that's all that matters to me. The verdicts came down a week later, delivered by a jury that had heard enough evidence of systematic corruption and violence to shock even the most cynical observers. Guilty on all counts for Sheriff Kincaid and his primary associates, with sentences ranging from 20 years to life in federal prison. The illegal mining operation was shut down permanently, its victims freed and provided with financial compensation. The new sheriff was appointed a former Army captain with no ties to the old corruption and a reputation for absolute integrity. But for Wesley and Evelyn, the real victory was smaller and more personal. On a crisp December morning, exactly 6 months after their first meeting on the train platform, They were married in the small Catholic church in Dust Valley. The ceremony was conducted by Father Martinez, a gentleman who had arrived in the territory after the corruption trials and had quickly become beloved for his commitment to serving all members of the community, regardless of their past mistakes or current circumstances. The wedding was small but significant. Rosa Valdez served as matron of honor, resplendent in a dress borrowed from the territorial governor's wife. Mayor Hutchins, who had found his courage during the trials and emerged as a genuinely effective community leader, gave the bride away in the absence of her deceased father. The congregation included former enemies who had found the courage to ask forgiveness, friends who had stood by them through the worst of times, and survivors of Kincaid's oppression who had finally found justice and peace. But perhaps the most meaningful presence was that of Li Wei, one of the Chinese workers who had been liberated from the illegal mining operation. He had become Wesley's partner in a new business venture, legitimate mining claims, in the mountains surrounding Dust Valley, worked by free laborers who were paid fair wages for their dangerous work. Li Wei's knowledge of mining techniques, combined with Wesley's understanding of the local terrain, had created a partnership that was both profitable and ethical. When the newly married couple returned to their ranch after the ceremony, they found a surprise waiting for them in the small garden plot behind the rebuilt house. Where Evelyn had been experimenting with desert plants, trying to coax life from the harsh soil, a single red rose had bloomed. It shouldn't have been possible. Roses didn't grow in this climate, in this alkaline soil under the brutal Arizona sun. But somehow, impossibly, it had found a way to survive and flourish. Desert Harvest Festival starts tomorrow, Wesley said, wrapping his arms around his new wife as they stood looking at the miraculous flower. The whole territory's invited to celebrate another year of survival in God's country. The Desert Harvest Festival had become Dust Valley's signature event, a week-long celebration that drew visitors from across the Southwest. What had started as a simple harvest celebration had evolved into something more complex, part county fair, part cultural exchange, part testimony to the possibility of building something beautiful in the harshest environments. There were contests for the best crops grown in desert conditions, displays of traditional crafts from the region's diverse cultural communities, and musical performances that blended Mexican, Chinese, and Anglo traditions into something entirely new. "Not to think they'll fully accept us now?" Evelyn asked, though she already knew the answer. The trials had changed everything, revealing truths about their community that forced people to examine their own assumptions and prejudices. The woman they had once tried to drive out was now respected as someone who had risked everything to expose corruption and protect the innocent. "Some will, some won't," Wesley replied pragmatically. "But that's their choice to make, not ours. We know who we are and what we've built together. That's enough." Evelyn leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the solid warmth of his body. Around them, the desert was coming alive, with the subtle signs of approaching spring new growth on the cacti. The return of migratory birds, the gradual lengthening of days that promised warmth and renewal. "I love you, Wesley Rowan," she said, using his full name in the way that had become their private tradition. "Not because you saved me from that mob, not because I needed a cover story, but because you saw something worth loving in a woman who had forgotten how to be herself. I love you too, Evelyn Hart Rowan. All of you, the federal agent who risked everything for justice, the survivor who refused to let the world break her spirit, the woman who's brave enough to plant roses in the desert and stubborn enough to make them bloom." As the sun set behind the red rocks that surrounded their valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple, they stood together in their small garden and made plans for the future. There would be challenges ahead in the mining business, to build a community to help heal from the wounds of corruption, children to raise if God blessed them with that gift. The work would be hard, but it would be honest work done by people who had learned the value of truth and the price of deception. The desert rose glowed like an ember in the starlight, its petals somehow more vivid and beautiful, for having bloomed in such unlikely soil. It had become a symbol, not just of their love, but of the possibility that beauty and goodness could flourish even in the harshest environments, given enough patience, care, and stubborn determination. In the distance, the lights of Dust Valley twinkled peacefully in the gathering darkness, a community finally free to become what it had always had the potential to be. The corruption that had poisoned the territory for years was gone, replaced by honest governance and the rule of law. The Chinese workers who had been enslaved in the illegal mines were now free citizens, many choosing to stay and build new lives in the land where they had suffered so much, but had also found liberation. Martha Fitch had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of anyone in the community. The revelation of Sheriff Kincaid's crimes had forced her to confront the role her own hatred and prejudice had played in enabling his corruption. She had spent months in prayer and reflection, eventually emerging as one of the most vocal advocates for tolerance and understanding in the territory. Her son's death, she had finally come to understand, had been caused by his own choices and the fever that followed, not by the imagined sins of a woman she had never bothered to know. The trials had revealed other uncomfortable truths as well. Many of the town's most prominent citizens had been complicit in Kincaid's crimes, either through active participation or willful blindness. Some had fled the territory rather than face justice. Others had remained to make what amends they could, using their wealth and influence to compensate victims and rebuild the institutions they had helped corrupt. But perhaps the most important change was more subtle, a shift in the community's understanding of what it meant to be neighbors in a harsh land, where survival often depended on mutual aid and shared sacrifice. The artificial divisions that had once seemed so important between Anglo and Mexican, between Christian and Buddhist, between those with respectable pasts and those marked by scandal or misfortune, had proven meaningless in the face of real moral challenges. As Evelyn and Wesley prepared to go inside their rebuilt home to begin their first night as husband and wife, in a house that truly belonged to both of them, they paused for one last look at the desert that stretched endlessly around their small oasis of warmth and light. "Do you ever regret it?" Wesley asked quietly. "Giving up your career with the federal service. You could have been running major operations, making real changes on a national scale." Evelyn considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked about the choices that had brought them to this moment. "I spent years thinking that the only way to fight injustice was from the inside, working within systems that were often as corrupt as the criminals they were supposed to catch. But I learned something important in this valley. Sometimes the most meaningful changes happen one person at a time, one relationship at a time, one community at a time." She gestured toward the lights of Dust Valley, where families were sitting down to dinner, where children were being tucked into bed, with stories and prayers, where people who had once been strangers were slowly learning to trust each other. "This is real change, Wesley. Not the kind that gets written up in federal reports or celebrated in Washington drawing rooms, but the kind that actually makes people's lives better. I'd rather be part of building something like this than spend my life chasing shadows and living lies." Wesley nodded, understanding completely. His own journey from bitter isolation to hopeful partnership had taught him similar lessons about the nature of meaningful change. Grand gestures and dramatic confrontations had their place. But the real work of building a better world happened in quiet moments, in small acts of courage and kindness, in the decision to trust another person despite the risk of being hurt. They turned toward their house, toward the warmth and light, spilling from its windows toward the promise of a shared future, built on honesty and mutual respect. Behind them, the desert rose continued its improbable bloom, a testament to the possibility that even the most unlikely dreams could take root and flourish, given the right conditions. The story was complete. The circle was closed. The past, with all its pain and deception, had finally been transformed into a foundation for something true and lasting and beautiful. In this remote corner of the Arizona territory, justice had been served, corruption had been exposed, and two damaged souls had found healing in each other's arms. As they crossed the threshold of their home together, Evelyn and Wesley carried with them the knowledge that they had helped write a new chapter in their community story, one that spoke of redemption rather than revenge, of hope rather than hatred, of the endless human capacity to choose love over fear, even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The desert night settled around Dust Valley with its familiar sounds and silences, and for the first time in years, it felt like a place where anything was possible. Where a federal agent could become a rancher's wife, where a broken-hearted widower could learn to love again, where a community poisoned by corruption could find its way back to decency and honor, where roses could bloom in the desert if tended with enough patience and faith. In the end, that was all the redemption any of them needed.